In February of 2025, 17-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick allegedly shot and killed her parents to death while they slept inside their Georgia home. She initially called 911 and reported finding them dead, and in the months that followed, posted emotional TikTok videos mourning their deaths, even urging true crime creators to cover the case, calling it a really big hit. But 5 months later, investigators charged Sarah with 2 counts of murder, citing physical and digital evidence they said tied her to the killings. She turned herself in and was denied bond, as prosecutors described what they called mountains of evidence, while family members publicly maintained her innocence. In 1999, Japanese woman Namiko Takaba was found murdered inside the apartment she shared with her husband, Satoru. With no arrests and very few leads, the case went cold, but Satoru refused to let it fade. Convinced that future forensic technology would eventually expose the killer, he kept paying rent on the empty apartment for 26 years, preserving the crime scene exactly as it was. Bloodstains, footprints, and untouched evidence remained sealed inside, costing him roughly $145,000 over decades. But finally, in late 2025, advances in DNA analysis finally produced a match from the preserved blood evidence. The suspect was identified as a former high school classmate of Satoru, who allegedly harbored a long-standing grudge after he rejected her romantically. Confronted with the DNA evidence, she confessed after her arrest. In March of 1998, 13-year-old Tristan Brubach left school in Frankfurt complaining of a backache and walked through the Liederbach pedestrian tunnel, a dim underpass children commonly used as a shortcut. While inside the tunnel, he was attacked and murdered in an extremely brutal assault. Investigators determined that the killer cut his throat so deeply that the wound reached his spine and nearly severed his head. After the killing, the attacker mutilated the body, removing Tristan's privates and taking them from the scene. Blood evidence suggested the killer remained in the tunnel for some time, staging the body and possibly washing himself in the nearby stream. Shortly after the murder, a man called police and calmly confessed, providing details only the killer would know. But when officers rushed to the tunnel, the caller had already disappeared. Despite decades of investigation, DNA analysis, and multiple suspects, Tristan's killer has never been identified. The Liederbach tunnel where the murder occurred was sealed off later that year and has remained closed ever since. Sorry in advance for this one. What the hell's wrong with people, man? In July of 2023, a 31-year-old man identified in reports as Mr. Liu was admitted to a hospital in China after experiencing severe abdominal pain, sweating, and signs of infection. You probably know where this is going. Doctors discovered he had inserted a live eel into his anus, which then forced its way through his rectum and colon. The eel used its sharp teeth to bite through his intestinal wall, causing a perforation that allowed bacteria and fecal matter to leak into his abdominal cavity, triggering life-threatening peritonitis. CT scans showed the eel moving inside his abdomen before surgeons performed emergency surgery. During the operation, they found the eel had punctured through the colon and entered the abdominal cavity. The eel was removed and the damaged sections of intestine were repaired, while surgeons cleaned out contamination to prevent further infection. He survived after intensive treatment, but doctors noted that without rapid surgical intervention, the injuries would have quickly led to organ failure and an extremely painful death. While staying at an Airbnb in Virginia in July of 2024, Joe Bartolozzi revealed that he was bitten by a Lone Star tick, a species linked to alpha-gal syndrome, a bizarre condition that can suddenly make people severely allergic to red meat after a single tick bite. Joe said he began experiencing symptoms consistent with the condition, meaning foods he had eaten his entire life could now potentially trigger hives, vomiting, breathing problems, or even anaphylactic shock hours after eating them. He later said the symptoms eventually improved, though some victims remain allergic to meat for years or even permanently. In 2004, 24-year-old American college student David Snedon vanished while hiking alone through China's Tiger Leaping Gorge in Yunnan province and was initially presumed dead after search teams found no trace of him. But years later, multiple defectors and South Korean intelligence sources claimed Snedon had actually been abducted by North Korea and forced to work as an English tutor for younger Kim Jong-un. North Korea denied the allegations, and Snedon's disappearance remains officially unsolved. In November of 2021, 66-year-old Spanish teacher Noema Graber was ambushed during her daily walk in a park in Fairfield, Iowa by 2 of her 16-year-old students. Prosecutors said the teens had studied her routine, waited for her at the park, and brutally attacked her with a baseball bat before hiding her body beneath a pile of railroad ties. One of the suspects later shared details of the killing over Snapchat, messages that ultimately helped investigators build the case. Both teenagers were charged as adults with first-degree murder and later accepted plea deals that resulted in life sentences with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Perhaps most disturbingly, investigators said the motive was shockingly trivial. One of the students was angry over a bad grade in her Spanish class. On March 1st, 2026, a shooting occurred inside Baptist Health Brookwood Hospital shortly after 24-year-old Precious Johnson had given birth to her first child. Police said Johnson had delivered a healthy baby just minutes earlier when around 9:30 p.m., her 19-year-old husband, Kenneth Terry Jr., pulled out a handgun he had brought into the hospital room and fatally shot her before turning the gun on himself. Both were pronounced dead at the scene, while the newborn baby survived and was not reported injured. The hospital immediately went into lockdown as officers secured the maternity floor and confirmed there was no ongoing threat. Family members later said the couple had been experiencing serious relationship problems in the weeks leading up to the birth, including disputes over which relatives would be present at the hospital. Police described the case as a domestic-related murder-suicide. George Washington died when his doctors were trying to cure his sore throat. They were using a process called bloodletting, which involved draining a patient's blood until their illness was cured. He lost nearly half his blood before they stopped the treatment, and he died a few hours afterwards. 26-year-old Mark Leeson suffocated in his sleep after shoving 2 tampons up his nose before going to bed. Apparently, he was just trying to find a solution for his snoring problem. It's estimated that throughout the world, about 25 people are killed by champagne corks every year. A British student was once taking an exam and couldn't handle the stress and anxiety anymore. So he put 2 pencils up his nostrils and headbutted the desk, forcing the pencils through his brain. He died instantly and all the other students got automatic A's.
My name is Kayla Mueller. I need your help. I've been here too long and I've been very sick. It's very terrifying here.
That was Kayla Mueller, an American aid worker from Arizona who traveled to the Middle East to help refugees and civilians affected by the Syrian civil war before she was kidnapped by ISIS and held hostage for nearly 18 months. According to reports, she was repeatedly raped and sexually abused by ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who allegedly treated her as his personal captive and sex slave and moved her between ISIS compounds across Syria to avoid rescue attempts. The footage shown here was part of a proof-of-life video released by ISIS, showing Mueller appearing terrified as she pleaded to be brought home. In 2015, ISIS claimed she was killed in a Jordanian airstrike, though U.S. officials later said there was no evidence the strike hit the building where she was being held, leading many to believe ISIS itself most likely killed her. If it wasn't for this man, it's possible that none of us would be alive today. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis between the US and the Soviet Union, the captain of a Soviet submarine thought they were being shot at by US naval ships and wanted to fire a nuclear torpedo in response. But in order for this to happen, 3 officers on board the submarine had to agree unanimously to fire the nuke. The first 2 men had given their clearance, but Chief of Staff Vasily Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. The men began arguing, but Arkhipov was a highly respected war hero known for his courage from a previous event. He ultimately convinced the captain to resurface and await new orders from Moscow. Thanks to him, a nuclear war was prevented from breaking out and humans were not made extinct. Tyke was a circus elephant that had spent years performing in traveling shows across the United States. Former handlers later claimed she showed repeated signs of stress and aggression after 12 years of harsh training, confinement, and constant transport. On August 20th, 1994, during a live circus performance in Honolulu, Tyke suddenly became agitated and attacked her trainer in front of the audience, killing him and severely injuring another handler before smashing through an exit and escaping into the streets. Panicked bystanders watched as the elephant rampaged through downtown Honolulu for nearly 30 minutes as police chased her through traffic. Officers eventually shot Tyke 86 times before she finally collapsed and died in the street. The incident later became one of the most infamous examples used by animal rights activists campaigning against performances of circus animals. Here's a photo of Filipina resistance leader and former schoolteacher Nieves Fernandez showing a U.S. Army private how she used a bolo knife to kill Japanese soldiers during the occupation of the Philippines in World War II. Fernandez helped lead a guerrilla resistance force after Japan invaded the country and was reportedly so feared by Japanese troops that a bounty was placed on her head. Historical accounts credit her unit with killing more than 200 Japanese soldiers during the war. Ty Pennington nearly died after ignoring what he thought was just a sore throat for over a month. In 2023, the infection turned out to be a massive throat abscess that became so severe it started blocking his airway, leaving him struggling to breathe. Pennington was rushed to the ICU, intubated, and flown to another hospital for emergency surgery. He later said doctors told him he easily could have died if he waited any longer to get treatment. In the early days of cars, drivers who killed pedestrians were often blamed for what newspapers called motor killings. But as deaths began to rise in the 1920s, automobile companies pushed the term jaywalker to shift blame onto pedestrians, helping normalize the idea that people hit by cars were at fault for their own deaths. The Cave Creek disaster occurred in 1995 at Paparoa National Park in New Zealand, when 17 people crowded onto a newly built viewing platform overlooking Cave Creek on a field trip. The structure suddenly tore away from the cliffside and collapsed forward, sending the group plunging nearly 40 meters onto the rocks below. 14 people were killed, most of them university students, while the survivors suffered devastating injuries. Investigators later discovered the platform had been catastrophically poorly built, with several missing bolts and critical structural flaws. However, no individual was ever criminally convicted over the disaster. Right after purchasing some hot coffee from McDonald's in 2004, 79-year-old Stella Liebeck accidentally spilled it into her lap, causing horrific third-degree burns. The woman quickly went into shock and was hospitalized for 8 days while undergoing skin grafts. Since the burns were so bad, her lady parts had melted and fused to her legs. Stella suffered permanent disfigurement after the incident and was partially disabled for 2 years. She then sued McDonald's for making the coffee way too hot and was only seeking $20,000 to cover her medical bills. But McDonald's refused to settle with Stella as the media completely demonized her, calling her the poster child of frivolous lawsuits. However, people quickly changed their tune when photos of the horrific burns finally released. With one of the jurors being so traumatized, he forced his wife to quit drinking hot coffee. Stella ended up winning $2.9 million in damages from the lawsuit, but her life was never the same again. In March of 1989, Texas college student Mark Kilroy went missing while vacationing for spring break just across the Mexican border. An extensive search took place that quickly turned dark when investigators discovered that Kilroy had been kidnapped by a drug cult that believed human sacrifices would protect their operations from law enforcement. On the cult's ranch, they found 16 bodies, including Kilroy's, that had been sacrificed in occult ceremonies. The student had been tortured, sodomized, and killed with a machete during a sacrificial ritual, after which his brain and spine were removed from his body. The cult's leader evaded capture by taking his own life, but 14 others were prosecuted for their heinous crimes. After George Harrison of the Beatles died from brain and lung cancer in 2001, his widow sued one of the doctors at the hospital where George received his radiation therapy. The man allegedly forced him to listen to his son play guitar and autograph the guitar while George was barely coherent in his final days. In 2020, Costco stopped selling Chowco coconut milk after its manufacturer was accused of using forced monkey labor. Groups of chained-up macaques were allegedly forced to pick coconuts and had their teeth pulled if they tried to resist. Costco halted purchases and demanded audits from the Thailand-based company to ensure humane practices. Here's an incredible video of a mother deer in someone's yard with not one but 2 albino fawns beside her. Albino deer are extremely rare, estimated to occur in roughly 1 out of every 20,000 births. Seeing 2 at once is even rarer, but it likely means the fawns are twins, sharing the same genetic mutation that prevents their bodies from producing any pigment. The condition gives them their ghost white fur and pink eyes, but it also makes survival in the wild much harder, since their lack of camouflage and vision problems make them easier targets for predators. Because of this, many albino deer unfortunately don't live very long in the wild. After traveling for 9 years and covering more than 3 billion miles, NASA's New Horizons spacecraft finally reached Pluto in 2015. When it flew past the distant dwarf planet, it captured this video revealing something no one expected. Massive icy mountains rising thousands of feet above Pluto's surface. Made of frozen water as hard as rock, some of these peaks rise more than 11,000 feet high. And because Pluto's so small, you can actually see the planet's curvature right behind them, making the mountains look enormous against the horizon. In 1880, the Queen of Thailand's boat capsized on the way to her palace. But despite many witnesses, nobody dared to save the drowning queen and her daughter. This was because touching the queen under any circumstances was a crime punishable by death. Bobby Leach was a world-renowned daredevil who became the second person to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. A few years later, he died from a vicious infection after slipping on an orange peel. In 1996, a man named Michael Paul was on his way home from church when he decided to crack his neck just like any other time. But a few minutes afterwards, he suddenly started sweating profusely and then went pale. By the time Michael was brought to a hospital, he had already slipped into a coma and died after 12 days of being on life support. An autopsy later revealed that the neck crack must have damaged one of the main arteries to his brain and resulted in a fatal stroke. In 2018, an English woman was drinking out of a glass with a metal straw when she suddenly fell with the drink in her hand. Tragically, she landed directly on the straw, which punctured her eye socket and went through her brain, killing her almost instantly. For 4 decades, Walter Freeman, the man who made lobotomies popular, had personally performed as many as 4,000 lobotomies on patients as young as 12, despite never being professionally trained to perform surgeries. At least 100 of his patients died from cerebral hemorrhaging. For many years, Beethoven kept his hearing loss a secret since he was afraid that revealing his deafness would ruin his career. He once wrote a note to his brother that he never sent, confessing that he'd been completely deaf since the age of 40, and explaining that it had an immense impact on his social life. Since many people assumed he was antisocial, Beethoven longed for human contact but became a recluse out of shame. All of this resulted in severe depression and made the composer contemplate taking his own life. In Gainesville, Georgia, a group of high school students decided to prank their math teacher by toilet papering his yard late at night. When 40-year-old teacher and golf coach Jason Hughes ran outside, he was reportedly joking around and pretending to catch them in the act as they ran back to their car. But as the teens tried to speed away, Hughes slipped on the wet pavement and fell into the road. One of the students, an 18-year-old driving a pickup truck, accidentally ran him over. Hughes was rushed to the hospital but tragically died from his injuries. The driver was initially charged with first-degree vehicular homicide, while several other students were arrested for trespassing and littering. But Hughes's family later asked prosecutors to drop the charges, saying the beloved teacher cared deeply about his students and never would have wanted any of their lives destroyed over a prank. A South African man adopted a baby hippo after rescuing it from a river. 5 years later, the hippo dragged him into that same river and mauled him to death. Last January, a Kansas man died after being shot by his dog in a freak hunting accident. He was sitting in the front seat of his pickup truck when his dog stepped on his rifle in the back seat. In 2011, a 49-year-old Russian woman had a heart attack and was presumed dead. A few days later, she woke up at her own wake and was so shocked that she screamed and had another heart attack, this time dying for real. In 1991, a woman from Thailand accidentally slipped in mud, grabbed a live wire, and was electrocuted to death. Later that day, when her sister was showing the neighbors how the accident happened, she slipped, grabbed the same live wire, and was electrocuted to death. Rama Haruna was born in Nigeria in 1996 and appeared healthy at birth, but at around 6 months old, she suddenly became ill and her body stopped developing normally. As she got older, most of her body stopped growing and she lost the ability to sit or stand, leaving her with a severely shortened torso and almost no functioning limbs. While her body remained extremely small, her head continued to grow and age normally, creating a striking contrast that doctors were never able to fully explain. Because she couldn't move on her own, Rama's family often carried her around in a large plastic bucket so she could leave the house. Despite constant pain, she remained mentally sharp and spoke about wanting to live a normal life. She died in 2016 at the age of 19 after living her entire life with the unexplained condition. In the 1840s, Anarcha Westcott, an enslaved black woman, was forced to undergo about 30 experimental gynecological surgeries performed by Dr. J. Marion Sims, who was later known as the father of modern gynecology. Sims was apparently trying to repair childbirth injuries called fistulas, and the procedures were carried out without anesthesia at a time when many physicians believed African Americans couldn't feel pain. Although his techniques influenced early gynecology, Anarcha has come to symbolize how much medical advancement was built on the suffering of enslaved women. Today, she's remembered as one of the mothers of gynecology, not for a discovery she chose, but for what she was forced to endure. A 57-year-old woman was riding a boat in Florida when an eagle ray suddenly leaped out of the water. The 75-pound ray smacked her directly in the head and she died almost immediately of a shattered skull. Attila the Hun was one of the most feared rulers throughout Europe during his reign, known for his brutal pillaging of Roman cities during the 5th century. But on his wedding night, he got drunk, fell asleep in his bed, and died of a nosebleed. A 17-year-old boy from Mexico City died after his girlfriend gave him a hickey. The suction created a blood clot that traveled to his brain, eventually causing a stroke. A Texas man was warned by bystanders to not go swimming in a harbor that was filled with alligators. but he shouted his last words, "F them alligators," before jumping in and being torn to shreds. Christopher John Sulos was a kind 37-year-old man with intellectual disabilities including autism who worked as a beloved greeter at a Chick-fil-A in Charlotte, North Carolina. But one day in September of 2024, a customer said there was an emergency and asked to borrow his phone. Instead, they stole it from him and used it to try transferring money from his account. They then began sending harassing messages to him and his family, falsely accusing him of being a pervert and other serious sexual misconduct. The perpetrators soon threatened to spread these accusations to his employer and the public unless a ransom was paid. The relentless harassment and fear of public humiliation caused Sulos severe emotional distress. Believing he had genuinely done something wrong, he tragically took his own life just a few days later. His family and federal investigators linked the cyberstalking, extortion, and false accusations directly to his death. The people responsible were later convicted and sentenced to 27 and 41 months in prison. This eerie burial suit from China's Liao dynasty was made between the 10th and 11th centuries, using woven silver wire, a bronze mask, and a metal crown to encase the dead. Elite members of the dynasty were sometimes buried in elaborate metal suits like this, because it was believed they could help preserve the body and protect the soul in the afterlife. A 700-year-old statue of the Hindu god Ganesha sits perched on top of Indonesia's active Mount Bromo volcano, where it has overlooked smoke, ash, and eruptions for centuries, as part of a sacred ancient site used by local Tenggerese worshippers. In 2024, researchers using LiDAR scans in Ecuador's Upano Valley revealed the hidden remains of a massive 2,500-year-old civilization buried beneath the Amazon rainforest, including huge networks of roads, plazas, homes, and agricultural structures that had remained completely concealed under dense jungle for centuries. Archaeologists say the site is so enormous that only a small portion has been studied so far, and future excavations could uncover far more about the lost civilization and how millions of people may have once lived deep within the Amazon. This video has been causing panic across the internet after two rare doomsday fish washed ashore on a beach in Cabo, Mexico. Creatures are called oarfish, long ribbon-like deep-sea animals that normally live thousands of feet below the surface and are almost never seen by humans. According to Japanese folklore, oarfish are known as messengers from the sea god's palace and are said to appear before major disasters. In reality, when oarfish are seen near the surface or close to the shore, it often means they're sick, injured, or dying, which is one of the reasons why sightings are so rare. But because of the old folklore surrounding them and recent current events, the appearance of two at the same beach quickly sparked alarm online. Scientists in Melbourne, Australia recently did something incredible by connecting about 200,000 living human brain cells grown in a lab dish to a computer and using them to play the 1993 video game Doom. Neurons, grown from human stem cells and placed on a microchip with electrodes, received electrical signals representing what was happening in the game. When the cells fired in certain patterns, the system translated that activity into in-game actions like moving or shooting enemies. Researchers said the neurons showed signs of learning through feedback, though they currently perform poorly and often die during experiments. The project, developed by Cortical Labs as part of its biological computer, is an attempt to combine living human brain tissue with silicone hardware. This was the moment drivers on a highway in San Antonio, Texas realized something was seriously wrong with the man behind a drifting SUV. Recognizing a medical emergency, 29-year-old Rene Valerio Albi pulled his truck in front of the SUV and gradually slowed down, allowing the runaway vehicle to bump into his bumper until both eventually came to a stop. The driver had suffered a heart attack, and a nurse who stopped at the scene began administering CPR, helping to revive him until paramedics arrived. Doctors said he's expected to make a full recovery thanks to the quick actions of a few strangers. Here's an insane clip of a man narrowly avoiding a horrific death by elevator. Commenters pointed out that he's lucky enough he didn't get crushed, but he also could have easily fallen down the shaft once the elevator moved. Here's a horrifying scene as tourists desperately flee an erupting Mount Etna in Sicily as thick plumes of ash and smoke rise behind them. Mount Etna is Europe's most active volcano and one of the most active in the world, erupting frequently as magma constantly pushes toward the surface beneath the mountain. Despite its constant activity, most eruptions involve slow-moving ash plumes that give people enough time to evacuate. Deaths from this volcano are extremely rare in modern times, though hikers and tourists have occasionally been injured after getting too close to active craters. In 1995, 15-year-old Elise Poller was lured to a remote eucalyptus grove in California by three teenage boys she knew from school. But what began as a planned meetup quickly turned into a brutal attack. Elise was stabbed multiple times and strangled, and her body was hidden in dense brush where it remained undiscovered for months. The case finally unraveled when one of the teens confessed to his youth pastor, who contacted authorities and led investigators to her remains. During questioning, the boys told police the killing was part of a satanic ritual that would help their struggling death metal band gain success. They specifically claimed they needed to sacrifice a virgin, a detail that shocked the community and drew national attention to the case. All three were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to decades in prison. In recent years, 2 of the men have been granted parole while the other remains in prison, a decision that's reopened old wounds in the community nearly 3 decades later. In 1998, 14-year-old Josh Phillips was playing baseball outside of his Jacksonville, Florida home when the ball suddenly struck his 8-year-old neighbor Maddie Clifton in the eye. Fearing the reaction of his abusive father, Phillips strangled Maddie inside his house, then dragged her body to his bedroom and hid her beneath his waterbed. For 7 days, as a massive search unfolded across the neighborhood, her body remained concealed just feet away from where family, friends, and volunteers gathered, unaware she was right inside the home the entire time. The crime was discovered after a strong odor led Phillips's mother to check under the bed. He was arrested and later convicted of first-degree murder. He remains incarcerated to this day. During the Vietnam War, U.S. Marine sniper Chuck Mahoney recorded 103 confirmed kills, the most in Marine Corps history. Operating in dense jungle terrain, he was known for precision and patience. And in one documented engagement, he recorded 16 confirmed headshot kills in roughly 30 seconds during an ambush. But unlike many wartime figures, Mahoney returned home and quietly left the Corps, taking a job with the U.S. Forest Service. For more than 2 decades, he told virtually no one, not even his own wife, about his record or role in Vietnam. His service only became widely known years later, when former comrades and military records brought his history to light. In July of 2012, 16-year-old Skylar Neese climbed out of her bedroom window after midnight to meet her 2 closest friends, 16-year-old Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf, believing they were going for a fun late-night drive. But instead, they crossed into a secluded wooded area in Pennsylvania, put on hoodies and gloves they had brought with them, counted to 3, and stabbed her more than 50 times in what prosecutors described as a premeditated attack. Investigators later revealed the motive was disturbingly simple. Schoaf said they didn't like her anymore and didn't want to be friends. For months after her disappearance, both girls publicly mourned her on social media, posting heartfelt tributes while knowing exactly where her body was. The case unraveled when Schoaf finally confessed and led authorities to Skylar's remains. She was sentenced to 30 years to life and was eligible for parole in 2023, but remains incarcerated after being denied release. Sheila Eddy received a life sentence and becomes eligible for parole in 2028. Initially known for her ridiculously large implants, German model and actress Martina Big says she identifies as black. She's had 23 breast augmentation procedures, as well as numerous perma-tanning treatments to darken her skin, eyebrows, and eye color. The woman says she was baptized as a real African woman while living in Kenya and hopes to build bridges between races. During a camping trip in June of 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Lloyd Martin was last seen hiding behind a bush, planning to jump out and scare his father before he completely vanished. Despite the largest search in Great Smoky Mountains National Park history, no trace of him was ever found. While serial killer Edmund Kemper was serving time in prison, he participated in the Blind Project, a volunteer program where he recorded audiobooks for the visually impaired. Kemper spent over 5,000 hours in the recording booth, as his deep voice was apparently well suited for narration. In 1978, Amos Atkinson held an entire restaurant of 30 people hostage while armed with a shotgun, demanding that his criminal friend be released from prison. But the situation took an unexpected turn when the man's mother stormed the building in her pajamas and hit Atkinson over the head with her handbag while telling him to stop being so stupid. Atkinson then surrendered peacefully. Mary Bell was only 10 years old when she committed 2 shocking murders in 1968, making her one of the youngest known child killers in modern history. Raised in a violently abusive home in Newcastle, England, Mary first killed 4-year-old Martin Brown by strangulation after telling him his neck looked sore and offering to massage it. She then returned to the scene days later to leave taunting notes saying that she would kill again. 2 months later, she murdered 3-year-old Brian Howe in the same way, not only strangling him, but also mutilating his body with scissors and carving the letter M into his stomach. Along with her 13-year-old accomplice, Norma Bell, Mary was arrested and showed no remorse during her interrogation. In court, she was only convicted of manslaughter due to her young age and served 12 years in prison before being released with a new identity. Mary and her daughter were granted lifelong anonymity by the court as her current whereabouts are unknown. In 2013, a young Japanese man began slithering on his parents' floor and acting erratically, claiming he had become a snake. His father then spent the next 2 days violently headbutting and biting him to, quote, drive out the snake that had possessed him. The man eventually died from blunt force trauma. In 2017, Minnesota woman Mona Lisa Perez killed her boyfriend by shooting him in the chest through an encyclopedia at point-blank range. Apparently, they were trying to make a viral YouTube video and didn't expect the bullet to penetrate the book. Just last month, an AI chatbot convinced a Belgian man to take his own life. Concerned about climate change, he apparently mentioned the idea of sacrificing himself so that the AI bot could save the Earth. Instead of dissuading him, the bot encouraged him to act on his dark thoughts so they could, quote, live together as one person in paradise. In December of 2025, a judge in Arkansas awarded joint custody of 6-year-old twins Eliana and Maverick Bialis to their father, Dr. Randy Bialis, after a full-day divorce hearing. Their mother, 40-year-old Charity Bialis, had represented herself in court and failed to convince the judge that Randy was abusive, despite the fact that earlier that year he admitted to strangling her in front of the children and pleaded guilty to third-degree battery, receiving a suspended sentence. Less than 24 hours after the custody ruling, deputies entered Charity's home after concerns were raised about the family. Inside, they found Charity and both twins dead to gunshot wounds. Investigators determined the home alarm had been deactivated from Charity's phone around 10 p.m. There were no signs of forced entry, and Randy's phone and vehicle records showed he was nowhere near the house. Authorities ultimately concluded that Charity shot Eliana and Maverick before turning the gun on herself, just days before she was scheduled to hand the children over to her ex-husband. Aeschylus was an ancient Greek playwright who is known today as the father of the tragedy genre. After receiving a prophecy that said he would die from a falling object, he spent most of his time outdoors. But he was killed when an eagle dropped a tortoise on him, mistaking his bald head for a rock suitable for shattering the shell of a reptile. Famous philosopher Kurt Gödel had an obsessive fear of being poisoned and therefore only ate food that was cooked by his wife. So when his wife went to the hospital for an extended stay, Gödel stopped eating completely and promptly starved to death. The first person to ever jump off the Brooklyn Bridge was a professional high diver. He wanted to demonstrate that people don't die simply from falling through the air, and he was correct. He fell 135 feet through the air without a problem, but hitting the water killed him immediately. Here's an insane video taken by a museum visitor showing the incredible detail in a painting from the 1600s. The artwork is cognoscenti in a room hung with pictures, painted around 1620 by Flemish artists Willem van Heekt and Jan Bruegel the Younger. Scenes like this were known as gallery painting, a genre that depicted wealthy collectors showing off rooms packed with artworks, sculptures, and curiosities. Many of the tiny paintings shown inside the scene are actually real masterpieces of the time, carefully recreated in miniature fashion. Here's a photo of mummified crocodiles in the Egyptian Museum, a practice that dates back more than 2,000 years in ancient Egypt. Crocodiles were associated with the crocodile-headed god Sobek, who was believed to control the power of the Nile and protect people from its dangers. In temples dedicated to Sobek, crocodiles were sometimes raised in sacred pools, adorned with jewelry, and treated as living embodiments of the god. When they died, priests carefully mummified them using linen wrappings and resins, just like they did to humans. Thousands of crocodile mummies have been discovered in Egypt, including entire burial caches filled with both adult crocodiles and hatchlings, which were likely offered as religious sacrifices to the god. This was the final note written by Marie Antoinette at 4:30 a.m. on October 16, 1793, just hours before she was executed in Paris, France during the French Revolution. Addressed to her sister-in-law Madame Elizabeth from her cell, the letter includes the lines, "My lord, have pity on me. My eyes have no more tears to cry for you, my poor children. Farewell, farewell." Later that morning, Marie Antoinette was taken through the streets of Paris and executed by guillotine at the age of 37. Here's a disturbing video of a man performing a religious milk offering ritual in the Ganges River in India, while nearby homeless and malnourished children rush in and try to catch it to drink. The ritual, meant to symbolize devotion and abundance, turns into a heartbreaking scene of desperation, as children who clearly have nothing to eat are forced to watch food being poured away, a moment that captures the extreme poverty surrounding one of the holiest rivers in the world. In 2012, archaeologists digging beneath a parking lot in Leicester, England, uncovered a human skeleton buried beneath several feet of asphalt. DNA testing later confirmed the remains belonged to King Richard III, the English king who was killed in battle in 1485 and had been missing for more than 500 years. One of the key clues was the severe curvature of the spine found in the skeleton, matching historical accounts that Richard had scoliosis and an uneven shoulder. The discovery solved one of England's oldest royal mysteries and revealed that a medieval king had been buried beneath what later became a modern car park.
Gedachtenis dient te worden op.
That was the moment a grieving father threw a chair at a judge inside a Dutch courtroom after hearing the sentence for the man responsible for killing his family members. In 2013, a speeding driver lost control of his car in Mayol, Netherlands, striking and killing a 2-year-old girl and her grandparents as they rode bicycles. The driver was initially sentenced to just 120 hours of community service and a 1-year suspended license, a ruling that sparked outrage in the courtroom. Prosecutors later appealed, and the sentence was increased to 15 months in prison and a 4-year driving ban. Elderly Englishman Stan Beaton kept a voicemail greeting recorded years earlier that included the voice of his wife Ruby, who died of cancer in 2003. For more than a decade, he would play the message almost every day just to hear her voice again. When a telecommunications system upgrade accidentally deleted the recording, engineers at the phone company spent several days searching archive servers until they were finally able to recover it. When the message was played for him again during a BBC interview, Beaton broke down in tears after hearing his wife's voice for the first time since it was lost. After leaving the hit sitcom Different Strokes and struggling to find success as an adult actress, Dana Plato spiraled into addiction, poverty, and run-ins with the law. In 1991, Dana entered a Las Vegas video store with a pellet gun and demanded all the money in the cash register, after which the flabbergasted clerk called 911 saying, "I've just been robbed by the girl who played Kimberly on Different Strokes." Dana soon lost custody of her only child, was caught forging prescriptions, and attempted to salvage her career by posing for Playboy, but found little redemption. By 1999, she was a faded star clinging desperately to the hope of a comeback, but her appearance on The Howard Stern Show turned into a public humiliation. Stern and his callers openly mocked her claims of being sober for 10 years, with some cruelly suggesting she was just moments away from another downfall. Within 24 hours of the interview, Dana died alone from an overdose of prescription pills at the young age of 34. During a World War II battle with the Soviets, Finnish soldier Imo Koivunen got separated from his unit with no food, water, or weapons. Other than his ski gear and clothing, all he had was the entire methamphetamine supply for his squad of 30 men. Although he'd never tried them before, the soldier decided to take one for some energy, but he accidentally consumed the entire bottle. Over the next few days, Imo skied over 250 miles, survived the blast of a landmine, and grabbed a bird out of the air before eating it raw. When he was finally found and brought to a hospital, the 26-year-old weighed 95 pounds and had a heart rate of 200 beats per minute. Imo became the first documented case of a soldier overdosing on meth during combat, but he survived and lived to 71. In the year 2000, 11-year-old Candace Newmaker died during an extreme therapy session in Colorado. The adopted girl was undergoing attachment therapy when 4 unlicensed therapists decided to perform the controversial treatment known as rebirthing. She was wrapped in a flannel sheet and covered with pillows to represent a womb and was told to fight her way out of it, with the apparent expectation that this would help her attach to her adoptive mother. All 4 therapists used their body weight to push down on Candace and resist her attempts to free herself. Candace screamed several times that she couldn't breathe and was gonna die, and even started to vomit, but was simply called a quitter by one of the therapists. 40 minutes into the session, Candace was asked if she was ready to be reborn, to which she faintly responded no, which would be her last word before she died of asphyxiation. All 4 fake therapists were prosecuted, 2 of whom were sentenced to 16 years in prison after the disturbing footage was shown in court. When Brian Spencer was called up to play in his first NHL game in 1970, he told his father Roy to watch the game that night since he knew he'd be interviewed between periods. But when he couldn't find a broadcast of the game, Roy drove to the nearest TV station in a fury and held the staff at gunpoint, ordering them to broadcast the Maple Leafs game immediately. The station complied, but as Roy was leaving the building, he was confronted by Canadian police and eventually killed after a standoff. The hockey player's life would end up spiraling out of control, as he would also be killed in a shootout after trying to rob his crack dealer. Wow, nice family, huh? During a hunting trip in 1913, race car driver Kamil Janatsky hid behind a bush and made animal noises to prank his friend before he was promptly shot. He was rushed to the hospital but died on his way there, fulfilling his own prediction that he would die in a Mercedes. In 1970, U.S. Air Force pilot Captain William Schaffner was ordered to follow a UFO over the North Sea when he ended up vanishing without a trace. A few weeks later, Schaffner's aircraft was found by divers and recovered from the sea. Strangely, its cockpit was sealed and the ejector seat was intact, but Schaffner's body was nowhere to be found. Here's why dozens of fishermen have lost body parts to a fish that was already dead. Wolffish have incredibly powerful jaws designed to crush shells and bones, but what makes them especially dangerous is that their bite doesn't always stop when they die. Even after the body is cut away, the head can still snap shut through lingering nerve reflexes, clamping down with enough force to take off a finger or other body parts. So in many cases, fishermen have reached down to grab what looked like nothing more than a discarded head, only for it to suddenly bite back from beyond the grave. This was the last photo taken of Juliana Marins after her fall on Mount Rinjani in Indonesia in June of 2025. The 26-year-old Brazilian tourist had plunged hundreds of meters down a steep ravine after being left behind while hiking near the crater. She survived the initial fall, and drone footage later showed her alive, moving and calling for help from a narrow cliff ledge where she remained trapped for 4 days. Rescue efforts were repeatedly delayed by thick fog, landslides, and the extreme terrain, leaving her completely stranded without any access to food or water. She was eventually found dead on June 24th, with an autopsy determining she died from severe internal injuries sustained in the fall. The case sparked widespread outrage, with her family accusing authorities and guides of critical delays and mismanagement. In 2016, Texas father Daniel Shaver was held up by police after he was seen pointing a pellet gun out of his hotel window. Several officers had rifles pointed at Schaefer in the hallway as he attempted to comply with them, but their commands were confusing and contradictory, especially since Shaver was drunk. For example, they told Shaver not to put his hands down for any reason before telling him to start crawling towards them. As Shaver was crawling and begging for his life, he reached back to pull his pants up and was killed instantly by Officer Philip Brailsford, who later claimed he thought Shaver was reaching for a weapon. Brailsford was charged with second-degree murder and found not guilty, since the full unedited footage wasn't released until hours after his acquittal. Brailsford was rehired by the department and reimbursed for all the medical expenses he paid, while seeking treatment for the PTSD he claimed he acquired from the shooting. Because of this, Brailsford was medically retired and now collects a $2,500 pension every month. In 2010, the teenage daughter of Michelle Kalina came across something horrifying in her mother's closet: the decomposed remains of 5 babies. Over the course of 14 years, Michelle gave birth to at least 5 children, ending their lives immediately after they were born. She was sentenced to between 20 and 40 years in prison. When Frank Zappa was a child, he always played with the mercury that his chemist father brought home from work, often covering his entire bedroom floor with the element. But childhood exposure to mercury is now known to cause prostate cancer as an adult, which Zappa would end up dying from at the age of 52. In 1978, over 2,000 students from Pennsylvania tried to set the world record for the largest game of tug-of-war. But instead, the 2,000-foot rope snapped, releasing several thousand pounds of stored energy. Nearly 200 students were wounded, 5 had their fingertips severed, and hundreds more received second-degree burns. In 1999, police were called to Matthew McConaughey's Texas home after his neighbor reported loud music and disturbances. When they arrived, ossifers found the actor playing the bongos while blazed out of his skull and completely naked. He was arrested for possession of marijuana. Many historians believe that the crotch part of medieval armor was enlarged not to make the knight's junk look bigger, but to prevent the pain caused by syphilis when their genitals rubbed against the metal. During the Cold War, the CIA highly considered using condoms as a weapon against Russia. They wanted to drop extra-large condoms that were labeled small on Soviet territory to lower their morale, but the plan was eventually scrapped. King Philip V of Spain and his court were known to play a game that translated to the imperturbable. A bunch of naked men would sit around a table covered by a cloth, while a lady underneath the table would put her mouth around one of their willies. The rest of the players would have to guess who was receiving it, and if their guess was correct, the player who was getting socked would have to leave the game. The game was won by the player who could climax without any of the other players noticing. Apparently, this game was very popular among French nobility in the 18th century. In 1904, 21-year-old Oda Banga was abducted from a tribe in the Congo and transported to the Bronx Zoo, where he was put on display alongside monkeys. He was placed in a small cage with an orangutan as an apparent depiction of evolution. Oda was given a functional bow and arrow to enhance his primitive image and to protect himself from the ape if necessary. Since visitors were far more interested in Oda than the actual animals at the zoo, the exhibit was extremely popular and began shattering attendance records. The zoo started seeing an average attendance of over 200,000 people per month, most of whom headed straight to the primate house to catch a glimpse of Oda Banga. But by 1906, Oda was finally released from his torment thanks to mass public outcry from the black community. A few years later, he attempted to return to Africa, but his plans were thwarted by World War I. After struggling to assimilate into American society, Oda fell into a deep depression and tragically ended up taking his own life in 1916.